So I would like to introduce Daljit Nagra to our conversation about Daljit Nagra, which must be quite an interesting experience for you as a poet, Daljit. In the context of all that you have read and the conversation everybody's been having for the last hour about Daljit's work, he really needs no introduction. But it does feel particularly auspicious to have him with us today, which is the day of publication of his fourth collection with Faber, British Museum.
That's it, yeah.
So it feels like the right day to be sitting and talking about Daljit's first collection from 2007, Look We Have Coming to Dover. I should also say that Daljit's voice will probably be familiar to all of you from BBC Radio 4 at the moment, because he is Radio 4's first poet in residence. And Daljit, every time you come on the radio, my mum rings me up. So I've got a much more lively relationship on the phone with my mum than I had this time last year. I'd like to start by inviting Daljit to read a couple of poems to get us started. I should say some of us have been reading your poetry out loud over the last hour, but now it's your turn. And then that'll lead us into a discussion with Daljit of the poetry in the collection.
Brilliant, okay, thank you. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for supporting poetry. Very important, isn't it? How about a room full of people embracing poetry? Exciting. So, I'll read one of the last poems I wrote for this collection, Booking Khan Singh Kumar. And in a sense, I guess it was a summing up of some of the things I've already been doing in the book, and it seemed to generate one or two further poems for me. So Booking Khan Singh Kumar. Must I wear only masks that don't sit for a Brit? Would you blush if I stripped from my native skin? Should I beat on my chest I'm a ghetto poet who discorded his kind as they couldn't know it? Should I foot it featly as a Punjab in Punglish, sold on an island wrecked by the British? Did you make me for the gap in the market? Did I make me for the gap in the market? Does it feel good in the gap in the market? Does it feel gooey in the gap in the market? Will I flame on the tree that your cannon has stoked? Will I thistle at the bowl where a bulldog was cocked? Should I talk with the chalk of my white inside, on the board of my minstrel blacked outside? Should I bleach my vile name, or mash it to a stink? Should I refuse straight, or gunga din this gig? Did you make me for the gap in the market? Did I make me for the gap in the market? Do I need to be good in the gap in the market? Do I need to be gooey in the gap in the market? As I've worn a sari bride and an English rose, can I cream off awards from your melting pot phase? Do you meddle yourselves when you meddle with my type? If I go up the spectrum, how far can you die? More than your shell-like, your clack applause, what bothers is whether you'll boo me if I balls out of Indian. Okay, then I'll just read one, which is right at the end. I think it's one of the last poems I wrote for the collection, and it probably shows a very different. No, that was the last one. I'm going to do one of the early ones. Yeah, the other way around. I'll do actually the first one I wrote that went into this book is called Digging. Let me find it. And then I've written it, and it felt so Heaney-esque, and I didn't really relate to it after a while, and I didn't really do anything with it. And I sort of, sometimes you get embarrassed by your work, and then it sort of surfaced later on, like a few years after. And I guess it's about that kind of. There's one Punjabi word in there, jameen, as in soil, earth. Okay. So that kind of idea of digging in. I used to be doing loads, so I was teaching in the school at the time and doing loads of private lessons in the evenings, to pay London rent and all that stuff. And at a certain time each year, I'd just be teaching digging kind of constantly, either for GCSE students or as a teacher at school. And I think it just sort of got into my brain, and this is what came out. So digging. Squatted against the bedroom door with left leg stretched, wiping sweat from my thigh. I shave hairs to the shape of a passport photo, into the good skin, stealing along the top end of the picture, a straight incision, until blob by seamless blob, over the Stanley knife, a rivering of blood. Once under the fold, down to the roots, nerve hand holds for slicing level the parallel lines of a photo, leaning deeper so the unconscious, deeper so the gore geometric be heaped up. I drop the silvery haft, the leg, lug back the flap. I hear a cry from some of myself. So this is me, this Jameen, this meat for which I wore myself, this. Okay, I'll stop there and then thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Daljit. Well, you having started us off with these two such different poems, the one with its really kind of pronounced sense of address and the other feeling so much more intimate, I wonder if I could start by asking you about your sense of a readership as you write, because it seems to me that those are two such interestingly kind of poised and opposed poems to begin thinking about that. Do you have a reader in mind as you write your poetry, or perhaps those two poems in particular?
Yeah, I think it's that the answer to that has changed with each book, or the last three. In the first book, and just thinking about this on the way over, and I just remember expecting, firstly, not to get a book published. I just didn't think that would be happening to me. So I carried on writing with great fun, which is kind of, it's been bad for me in a sense. I haven't got any archive. I don't have a single draft of any of the poems first book. I used to write and abandon, just expecting it would be a fruitless adventure, but a happy one. So in that sense, I probably wrote very much in the ideal that I just don't, I'm writing for me, I don't care. I know I'm never going to publish a book, and I'm going to use bad English, I'm going to mess it up, and I'm going to try out things. So I felt very liberated. And then I think some point along, I went to get poems published in magazines, and I knew how to kind of work for an audience much more than. I was trying to write, I guess, essentially for a white middle class audience, because they're the ones who read poetry, and they were the ones, even when I was, before the first book, going to readings, that was the audience. I just don't remember ever meeting kind of someone from an Asian background. So it was making sure the kind of cultural aspects of my background that I brought into the poems could be understood, or I had the skills to facilitate a relationship with the audience.
So how has that changed over time then? So you've talked, I mean, I guess that's kind of a cheat add-on question, given that Look We Have Coming to Dover is what we're talking about today. But given that you've suggested that that's changed over time, I wonder whether that white middle class audience is the one which you feel is your readership now, and whether you have that kind of consciously in your mind.
Yeah, I think I probably do actually. Still, it's very much that audience. And I think my poetry has become clearer, which I don't know if I've sold out, as it were, like you do your first album, it's really edgy, isn't it? But in this latest book, I think it feels very, on the surface, language, the grammar is very clear. And I think that's probably because I was trying to write a much quieter poem in the latest book. But I think the first three, there was an aim to be loud as possible and see if the audience could stomach that. And because the first book was successful, I thought I'm going to go even louder, and I don't care, and I didn't expect to be successful. How dare I be successful? I'm going to write really offensive, loud poems. So and then I did the version of Ramina, and I tried to be even louder. And then now I've had to sort of learn to calm down. This is a career, it's almost that kind of mentality. I can, I am going to get published regularly. I can start thinking about the ideas in a different way, in a more nuanced or a different type of nuance, I think.
So everyone's got to buy the new book now so that we can read the quiet Daljit. Can I ask you about the poetic monologue, which is the form in which I think every poem in Look We Have Coming to Dover presents itself? And I guess I wondered what is it that attracted you in this collection about, I mean, insofar as you conceived it as a collection, which I guess you've already suggested for a long time you didn't, or only in a kind of the most intimate sense. What was it about writing in the first person that appealed to you as a poet, and perhaps also thinking about in terms of a kind of address to a readership?
I do remember sort of thinking about Shakespeare in particular. You know, they sort of get those great soliloquies, and they always contextualise, aren't they? There's somebody's doing something, and I want to kind of capture that as much as I could, get a kind of dramatic richness in a kind of poem. And I was also really into the idea of the oral and the written, trying to find ways to mingle the two. So in some sense, I think I saw some of these pieces as almost dramatic moments, where, you know, lots of kind of things are implied, or lots of things potentially are happening, and I've just caught it at a moment, and then the reader can decide what they want to make of it and try and make it as complex as possible, without trying to make the surface complex. So I have these dramatic scenarios, and the dramatic monologue really suited it, and I really like Robert Browning anyway, and that gave me license, you know, the way he can be really crude and write and really say ordinary things in ordinary language. So that gave me freedom, and I guess the Shakespeare stuff gave me freedom to just put words in the mouths of these very ordinary Indians. The ones I was after were essentially the uneducated ones wherever possible, in that collection. That's my kind of background, and I want to write about those particular Indians specifically. And I knew I couldn't sort of translate, and that just felt a bit of a folly trying to translate. So I thought I'd create a fictional English, a fabricated English. You know.
Lovely. I will ask one more question, if I may, have my kind of chair's license to ask one more, and then turn the conversation over to the room. Thinking perhaps specifically about this first collection, were there things about the ways in which it was taken up or represented or worked with that particularly surprised you or delighted you or aggravated you? What was your sense of its kind of life out in the world, and did any of that kind of provoke a particularly strong reaction in you, or does it continue to?
I guess the one thing is the success of it. That was really genuinely unsettling for me. It sounds really weird to say that, doesn't it? I mean, firstly, I didn't expect to get published. Certainly didn't expect favour, and then when it came out, I was expecting it to be kind of torn apart, and then it was very successful. I mean, and I was getting loads of readings on the back of it, and I found that really unsettling. So I think I kind of expected those sort of things where you get Smoser nights, like Smossol, where you get poetry events where you're invited to read. It might be you and maybe another Asian, and it'd be a Smoser night. So I did quite a few of those, or curry night, and I'm going to get a couple of Asian. And that's not being offensive. I mean, that's one way to get people in, I guess, in different regions. So I was expecting that. And I didn't mind it, actually. It's got nice food. But
you didn't get samosa night.
I liked it. Yeah, it's good. But yeah, the book was taken seriously, I think. That was really surprising. I'd expect the other stuff since then to be taken seriously, but for me, this was just, I was trying to not be clear. I wanted to be clear, but not clear. And I wanted to, because I felt I was writing for me, so I wanted the poems always to have these kind of weird words in, that probably the wrong word deliberately, unsettling, and the poems never sat down, they never settled down. I wanted to have that nervous working class energy, that living on your wits kind of energy. That's where I felt at the time anyway, when I was writing, as I remember it. Yeah.
Oh, I've got so much more I want to ask you about that, but that would be selfish and unkind to everyone else in the room. So maybe if there's time at the end, or as we drink wine after our discussions. Can I open conversation out to the floor? Erica has a microphone, which she will hand to you.
It's for the recording for the podcast, just so you know. Don't expect your voice to be amplified.
The first question. It's always off after that.
Thanks. I'm just building off the back of that first question that you were asked, and thinking about the audience that you have in mind. Did you ever write for a non-British audience? And where this question is coming from is because when I first encountered your work as a non-British person reading it not in Britain, it seemed that you were consciously trying to unsettle a British audience, but then that unsettling effect was less unsettling reading it from Singapore, where I was. And it seemed obvious to me that you were doing something different, but that difference was very much situated in Britain. And it wasn't necessarily a difference that was intended to speak to world literature as such. So did you ever have a world audience in mind? And what did that world audience look like? Was that also a middle-class world audience? Was that a kind of different diasporic audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't really expanded my horizons in that sense. It's a funny thing because on the one hand you're aware you're ideally writing for an Indian audience. I felt I was writing for an uneducated Indian audience, but I know they're not going to read the book. Okay, like say my parents have never read my poems, and you know my mum still can't read any English. Yet some of the poetry is about that community. So on the one hand you're aware you're doing that. But on the other hand, you know your audience is going to be somebody completely different. So you play that kind of a slightly shifty game, or you're aware you know you're writing for them, but you know you're really writing for them, but you're actually writing for that audience. But yeah, I didn't think beyond Britain at all. But I mean, I guess it's that thing. I mean, I sent a manuscript off to Redbeck Press. If you've heard of it, this sort of tiny little press, and the editor at the time, David Tripton, who passed away a few years ago, sent me this lovely letter saying, I think your work deserves a bigger publisher, so I'm going to turn it down because I'd only be able to do 50 copies and I wouldn't be able to send any to press. So obviously at the time I felt insulted. And I was aiming for this little, you know, I thought, wow, this is me, this is my niche. And I was thinking, well, what's wrong with 50 copies? Why doesn't he want to do 50 copies? That would be great. So I guess I was thinking like that, really. That it's probably because that's maybe cynical, isn't it? Because I imagined maybe a white middle class audience wouldn't want to read these sort of poems. So I guess I was surprised, getting back to the reception, the audience question. I didn't think anyone would be interested. But yeah, so that was a big kind of, getting back to your question, kind of big awakening. But yeah, I hadn't thought about diasporic. And then I met one or two, when I did some readings in Canada, I met people when I've been to India who've shown interest in my work. So that's been really surprising for me. And they've talked in the way you did, actually, sort of much more in a global sense. They seem to connect up, oh, you're an Asian, British, so we're thinking of you in a post-colonial sense and how you connect to other writers around the world. And I hadn't actually thought of that kind of, at that point anyway, in that kind of grand way.
Do we have more questions?
So we were talking a lot in our reading group with your stuff about the kind of glossary thing that you put at the back. Was that something you were encouraged to do by your publisher, or was it something that you thought was necessary to kind of put in almost like another poem? Is that, obviously it's to do with the readership, so I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. No, it was just me. It wasn't my editor. He was fine either way. And we did have a discussion about it. And I think we're partly talking about, I remember vaguely now, talking about Salman Rushdie and how he doesn't have a glossary. And I guess my angle was, why would I expect a British audience to know the language of a tiny little Sikh Punjabi community? I wouldn't expect them to know those words in the way that, say, I don't know about other different communities that live in Britain. So I felt it was good to have a glossary and maybe play with it, you know, in the way sort of Eliot plays The Wasteland. Mine's a bit more puerile though, I think. His is kind of a high art kind of play, isn't it?
Yeah, all the better for it. I can't resist interjecting saying that I have had students in the classroom where I've got them to sit down and read the glossary as another poem in the collection, and it works really well. If anyone would like to steal that classroom tip, it's quite effective. Do we have any more questions?
I think the first is a request. Daljit, I would love you to read Singsong, at least part of it. We had great fun with it, you know, in the hour preceding your arrival.
That was a request, yeah.
The second thing is, you know, so much of look we have coming to Dover is about, you know, the migrant as they are seen and heard, you know, this sort of auditory and visual objecthood of the migrant. And I wondered how, you know, what was your gaze when you looked at India? You know, I mean, in a way, do you think that sometimes, you just said, you know, in answer to the first question, that you didn't really think outside of Britain, but, you know, how do you locate this English, your Punglish, you know, to the other kinds of English that are being spoken in India? You know, how do you kind of connect to that, or is there no connection? Do you see your writing as a sort of variant of kind of, you know, literatures in English in Britain? Or do you see, I mean, what is the sort of, Indian writing in English to sort of trot out a very old, that's what it was called when I was at university, Indian writing in English. We didn't have a name for it. Definitely post-colonial literature wasn't used. So I just wanted to know about what your thoughts were about the Indian kind of, say, poetry emerging out of India, which is also doing stuff with voice and vernacular, and this kind of difficulty of writing in a language that's kind of not something your mother reads.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the thing you just touched on at the end is that there's something your mother doesn't read, and there's that angst, isn't there, in sort of the Indian writers writing English, that they're kind of excluded from the big dialogue in India, and they kind of some of the poems are about how we're writing in a language that isn't ours, and I could really relate to that. I read some stuff before the first book came out by a few authors, and since then, so I could relate to that kind of inevitable dialogue that takes place where you're an insider outsider. The difference being, I guess, I'm writing in the host country, whose language it is, so I feel much more confident in writing those poems in English, say, than somebody writing them in India, whose audience isn't the kind of native country of English. So I think there's a difference, maybe more confidence, maybe more arrogance of someone like me that would probably take place. I feel this is my country, the language I speak and write in is the language of the country I was born in, and that gives me a kind of authority. I can be right inside, I can write about British identity and Britishness, but also then slip outside and be an outsider and do those two things very, very confidently. So I think there's a slightly different dialogue that takes place in India to what someone like me is able to do. Or I know you've had Bernadine, she has that, I think, in her work, for me anyway. That inside or outside is there, isn't it, with every line, every word.
Hello. I'd just like to apologise, first of all, that I missed the entire reading. I mean, I'm really frustrated. I live in Oxford, but I could not find the way here. And I went to a very good discussion at lunchtime where I was told where to come, but there was also some discussion about walls in Oxford and within the university. And actually, I discovered that today, coming here. Where do you find this building within the complex? Anyway, that's just a preface. Sorry about that. But I just had one little question and well, a request, but I think the speaker before asked, the audience member before asked whether you might read one more poem.
Yeah, I'll read something at the
so
end.
I would be very grateful, because I haven't heard any of your poems read. I just wanted to ask, I sort of caught up when I came in, shortly after I came in, when you said that your parents, or your mother in particular, couldn't read your poems in English, and I just wondered, have you ever translated them into her tongue, your mother tongue?
I can't write in Punjabi. I can speak it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I don't think anyone in my family's shown any interest.
Right.
They're not really readers. They don't read. None of my relatives really read books. They don't seem to have books at home. So no one's ever asked me about the poems. So which actually is to my strength.
Fair enough.
I can write about them and create characters. And
Okay.
they're not. I don't think they're going to read them, because some of them would have challenged me by now, I'm sure, some of the things I've said about them in the poems.
Thanks. I was interested when you said that, especially for this collection, but presumably for more recent as well, you like the poems to be on their feet, they don't sit down. And one of the ways you implied you do that is that you kind of conceal things within them, create layers, little codes for yourself, maybe, that you think about all these different layers going on. But I wondered if, when you come back to read a collection like this, 10 years after you wrote it, they ever stand up and and surprise you, like as you know, you see things that you had not smuggled away in there, and whether you have any examples of those.
I think one of the things I was thinking about, and I was just flicking through it the last few days, there's far more words with a Punjabi inflection to them than I'd remember. So words seem to have double meanings, that they could be read as an English word, that there's bits of Punjabi or Hindi creeping into the book, much more than I think I was aware of. In that sense, also probably livelier now. I mean, stuff I've been writing the last 3-4 years, this feels really pacey, lively, and loud compared to that stuff. So that sort of surprised me, that it still is fairly kind of rambunctious, shouty, that kind of thing, I think.
On the thing about shouty, Daljit, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the exclamation marks in the titles of the poems and in the title of the whole collection. So everything about the exclamation marks, you know, what you were thinking of doing with them, whether Faber was okay with them, because, you know, Faber is Faber, whether they have different kinds of meanings, maybe different colors, you know, are there black ones and red ones and green ones kind of thing. Yeah, just about the exclamation marks.
I think, I guess it's firstly a response to what you're reading at the time, and a lot of the poetry being published then was fairly, you know, quiet and introspective, and the way my poetry was going, I was partly thinking about the way two people, my relatives, sit next to each other and be shouting and they're having a conversation. And I want to kind of recreate some of that. And also that music, the way the kind of line just sort of, you know, just lifts, the music of the exclamation. You can't just come to a kind of flat ending. You can't just suddenly stop it. Kind of, it's a big kind of lift off and ascension. And I want to write lines. At some point I realised, I like the exclamation. I want to write lines which warranted the exclamation. So the kind of phrasing had to be kind of sufficiently rich and sufficiently expressive, emotive, to warrant the exclamation, just to kind of go over the top, just to push it towards a further kind of edge. It completely surprised me when the book came out. So many people were talking about the exclamation. I didn't realise it's such a big deal. I just hadn't realised. It seemed to be the main feature of the collection. It seemed to, for people, it seemed to summarise what was going on in the work. And I guess I partly want to think, you know, the oral kind of quality, thinking the romantic poets, that kind of heightened emotive quality. I want to get back to that. But I didn't think I was doing any sort of radical original. I just assumed there'd be loads of other poets who were doing that, and I hadn't really spotted them. So yeah, it was a complete surprise. But yeah, I think it kind of, to me, it varies quite a bit in the poems, depending on who's speaking. So an exclamation, there's an exclamation of despair, the exclamation of kind of confidence. So to me, it varies. It's never just one piece of punctuation. I think the tone changes with the music according to the speaker or the kind of moment. So it does have a different weight, I think. So some lines are kind of, the pitch goes up, whereas others it goes up just a little bit, but it's slightly more exclamatory. So it varies to me, in my head anyway, when I was writing them.
I'm sure you know this. I have a child doing GCSEs at the moment, writing them, and for his English, he's been told not to use any exclamation marks at all. Right? So there's something about them that's obviously seen as dodgy or indulgent, or yeah.
Yeah, one of my daughters in primary, in year 2, they've been told they can use exclamation. Can't remember only 2 different ways. And so they've been given very strict guidance for their SATs tests. There's you know, this is kind of stuff that came out with Go a few years ago, but it's still in place. So they're actually teaching that at the moment. There's only 2 ways you can use. There might be teachers, primary school teachers who know about this. So I can't remember what they were. There's 2 ways you can use the exclamation. So yeah, it's still terrifying.
It's very policed.
Yeah, it scares people, doesn't it?
It's a really interesting stripping out of voice, isn't it? The insistence on a removal of exclamation marks. It's like, you know, we have to, you know, we take in undergraduates and have to, you know, gently coax them back into being able to write I, because they've been coached throughout the entirety of secondary school that, you know, first person, which seems to me to, you know, have a kind of analogous question around it as the exclamation mark is, you know, kind of like stripping yourself out of your writing, and that's where writing becomes good writing.
Interesting.
Whereas the entire force of this collection works to turn all of those rules around. We had a hand up over here and one over here.
I'm an English teacher as well, so just coming back to that, what's something you said about that you weren't aware of some of the echoes of the language that you're using in Punjabi.
Yeah.
In Singsong, we had a girl, after I'd taught it several years, there was a Sikh girl who said, but miss, these words mean these other things, and I just wanted to check with you whether it was deliberate. So pinny, we thought it was pinny being an apron, but actually she said it was a turban.
Oh yeah, it can be,
And Putney being the Punjabi
Putney,
for wife. Yes, that's right. And we suddenly thought, oh, it's opened us up, and this is all so interesting.
I think I've got more in there than I realised. I think I just got on and I was looking through it, thinking, there's quite a lot.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to ask is, as you've mentioned already, that you've been influenced by being an English teacher, by things that you were reading or having to teach as an English teacher. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think you learn as a teacher is about audience. So, that really helped me, I think, with the book, thinking about how you relate to the audience. The good classroom poem. And to some degree, I was trying to write the good classroom poem, but also break out of that. You know, the good, neat classroom poem with the line breaks and everything's perfect. So I was kind of aware of that. I think that sort of school, being an English teacher, is really good education for what makes a good classroom poem. Then, you've got that as a template, then you can break the rules as and when, because it becomes so kind of, and I'm sure you find that as well, there's certain poems that go in anthologies and others will never be in there. So that was useful. And just thinking about how to affect an audience, because when you're teaching poems in schools, you're trying to get students to feel the emotions, and I think that was really helpful for the monologues, where you need to change the emotion all the time. You can't just be to one track, especially the type I was writing. I want kind of a moment of sort of joy, and then undercut it with a different emotion, maybe sarcasm, maybe irony, maybe anger. So that was really useful, I think, teaching me how to think about an audience all the time, obsessively. And I think monologue needs that, doesn't it? Dramatic monologue. And I don't come from an acting or theatre background, so I think I picked up those sort of skills from partly classroom and partly watching people like Browning at work, the way he does it.
There was a hand up over this side.
I was just going to say on that topic, so the fact that your poetry is now on school syllabuses, GCSE syllabus, and that obviously means that it's far more accessible to the kind of non-white, non-middle class audience. And I was wondering if you thought, for the people who are reading your poetry in schools and perhaps thinking poetry isn't for me, and that's kind of their mentality surrounding poetry, do you think that your poetry sort of addresses that, and how can we address that? How can we get people who are thinking poetry isn't for me, this doesn't relate to me, none of this is for me? How can we get them to kind of read?
Well, I think maybe the best way, beyond anything else, is the fact of a brown face and a brown name writing the poetry, and it's in the classroom. And it comes from, like, my writings from come from an ordinary background. I think that's probably more liberating than anything I'll ever write in a poem. So I could probably write a really high art, obscure poem, like maybe that we have Coming to Dover, the poem is. But the identity itself, I think, is really liberating for people. Just that an ordinary person can write poetry, because I think that held me back writing poetry for a long time. And I just thought you had to be a certain type of person, you had to be really clever from a certain background to write poems. And I wrote a few in my I was 19, 20, and then stopped, and then started writing again when I was sort of about 30. But even then, I just wrote as a hobby, because I hadn't sort of seen a real poet in the flesh. The ones I'd sort of seen seemed to be from a certain background. I thought, that just confirms my stereotype of poetry. So I think that's probably the best thing, actually, just having just ordinary people in state schools, ordinary poets in state schools. Maybe it should be a project for that. I think there is, isn't there? It's called AQA, isn't it? They're pretty good at that, aren't they?
We've been talking about children and education. My daughter is 10 and she writes poems. She just spontaneously writes them and they're okay, and she plays with language and stuff. And so given what we've said about how rigid the teaching can be, how would you inspire a young person who's interested?
I think probably just same as anything in education is not to score it, not to grade it. I mean, primary schools still do a lot of grading of creative writing. And the other thing, and I know one daughter's in year 2 and the other's in 4. When they write poems, then they have to talk about what they've done in the poem, and they have to so they basically get into analysis. And already they're teaching them the logical part, the analysis, is more important than the poem. So, and that's been really drummed into their heads. So, I mean, that seems really fascistic to me. It's like, we are here to teach you that creativity is bad. The analysis is everything. So maybe not grading that stuff and not putting it alongside reasonable time. And when I was taught in secondary school, that used to happen a lot then. If students ever were encouraged to write a poem, there would always be a commentary on the poem. But the commentary was always assessed. It was never, you weren't allowed to assess the poetry. So it'd probably take a massive shift, wouldn't it, of thinking as a country. Maybe it's too despairing to think of it, isn't it?
Has anyone got a question that will cheer us up now?
Yeah.
I've got one that's not very cheerful, but might be interesting. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about class. I've noticed that each time you've spoken about it, you said white middle class readers, and they said I'm a normal person. Or you could.
So we'll put the two together.
Yeah. Well, I just thought that was striking. I just wondered if you could speak a bit more. I mean, quite often it's perhaps framed through identity of another kind, but it seems to me that class is important to you. So I wondered if you could just speak about that.
Yeah, it has been. Yeah, I think we're talking in this book. It was really important. Because, I went to university, like, we didn't do GCSEs, the O-levels, we did CSEs, and I did carry the shame and the humiliation of that for a long time, where, from the age of about 11 up to, I don't know, my 20s, I always felt like, we were condemned, we were aware we were condemned, we went to school we didn't want to go to, and we knew we were the bottom of the pile, absolute bottom, and our school was one of the first ones shut down when the academies came out. And you was really aware, and everybody else was aware we were at the absolute worst school. Because somebody, there'd always be somebody who had a relative who's, had a cousin who went to a thing called a grammar school or a private school you heard of. And you see these people and they spoke differently to you. So you're always aware of that kind of inadequacy. So I think it took me a long time to get through that kind of class shame, I'd say, literally shame of I'm not good enough. I was... like when I was 15, where careers interviews were all told to go and work at the airport, that kind of thing. Live near Heathrow Airport, everyone's told to go and get a job at the airport, and that condemnation, you felt you had to fight through that, and if you were coming through that, it felt quite perverse. My best friend, who I think was very bright, he just got a job at 16 because his family expected him to do that, and they would have been appalled if he'd carried on beyond that. So that kind of, I guess, is coming through that world, and I just think that goes on now, and I don't think it's really changed. And when I was working in schools, that still seemed to be there. That feeling of you're not entitled. You're not entitled to do these things. You should go out and get a job. That feeling, I think, is still pervasive. I think. But for me, it took a while to get through that thing. So I think that was there in that book in particular. That probably isn't there with the work now.
Sort of picking up on that, you talked about writing for a white middle class audience. I'm wondering, what do you think? You said you didn't think that audience would be interested when you were writing yourself. Why are they interested? What do you think's going on in that kind of jumping both the kind of racial or cultural grouping and a class grouping, and what need might that serve, or what kind of politics happens in that gap between the subject of the poem and the group who tends to read it and the group who tends to review it, and the Faber who publish it, and in that gap what kind of happens? Yeah,
the gap, that's a very interesting word actually. It's tricky to know what it is exactly. I always think it's sort of news that people like me bring news of a community. And I'm probably quite cynical in that sense. When I see somebody from a different background writing, some part of me is thinking, oh, we're going to learn about that community and how they function in Britain or America. We were talking about Ocean Vuong, and went to see him last week. He's a Vietnamese-American poet, and he's doing a reading in London, and I think he's doing a few readings there. And I bought the book, and I partly read it, partly because of his Vietnamese background. So suddenly, I was a voyeur into the news of what it must be to be Vietnamese to go to America. So I think maybe there's some part of that that's in play as well, just that curiosity, and to see, and maybe also just see how the people from a minority community, how they play with a certain art form, an exclusive art form, should we say, a rarefied art form like poetry. What will they make of it? So there's that curiosity. So what I mean for this amazing poet, by the way, Ocean Vuong, and that's apparently his name, Ocean, spelt like the ocean. But it's really, really exciting poetry. So so it's partly to see what they're going to make of that art form, and what information they bring in. And the kind of information he's bringing in makes poetry feel fresh, partly because of the words, the details he brings in, I think. So in a sense, you're just looking for something different. And which is kind of makes it slightly more of a crisis, say, for white heterosexual males, doesn't it, who are writing poetry? Because there's been, several hundred years of that. What do you do now to make your poetry sound fresh? And that's genuine. That is hard, isn't it? I imagine. So in a sense, it's easy for people like me, because I can just write about my community and it can sound quite fresh. So I became aware of that at some point, that I've got a head start. So it might come from this background, but in other ways you've got a head start, because of what you're writing and where you're coming from. In poetry, it gives you kind of an edge. Wonderful.
And that was a positive note we were looking for. I think, by my reckoning, we've got time for maybe one more question, and then we should. We've had a request for Singsong, and perhaps we can have a request for one more poem for Daljit to sing us out. Sorry, there was a hand up out there.
I was just wondering if it's too much to say that you're striding two different worlds or two different communities, and if that's the case, could you comment a bit on that? And if that's not the case, then I would be interested to hear how that feels to you, being a poet, and, as you said, trying to connect different cultures, or coming from one culture, writing for another one.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one way I was trying to do that, if I talk about words, is just trying to position words from different fields together, and sometimes words slangy, say, with very formal diction, or Punjabi words with English. So my idea was to have this kind of merging of different cultures sitting together, line by line, in a kind of, in love, in harmony, as it were, in a kind of musical kind of, enjoyment, and a kind of frisson. So I would think of it in those terms, and I was really aware in that collection much more now, because I was writing about that ordinary community, ordinary Indians in Britain, and trying to marry the two together. And one way was to the words themselves, how they sat together in a line, and sometimes in those collocations there's two words together, the combinations. So that felt really exciting to me, actually. I think that's the main reason why I found poetry exciting, because of that immediate kind of collaboration, that immediate kind of UN kind of relationship you get with words, when you say it like that. Maybe that's one way to answer it, isn't it? I think.
Given that was a beautifully crisp question and a beautifully crisp answer, have we got time just for one very short more question? Oh, Elika's making a very, very small question mime. Even better. So we'd like Singsong from you.
I thought number 49. Okay, I hope it's one of those that I can how to read.
Are there any you can't read?
Yeah, there's 2 or 3. I've never found a voice for...
It's always smiley blacks.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, that's for me as well.
I never found a voice for Bibi and the Streetcar Wife, and a couple others, some of the monologues.
Oh.
I think kind of found the way to say it.
But would you be willing to do Always Smiley Blacks
Yeah, I can do that, I reckon, yeah.
Okay, so...
And then Singsong after.
Please.
That's the last two in the book, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So this came out of Look We Have Coming to Dover, that poem, and had kind of a whole set of images in there. So I realised we could split them into two poems. It's very, very exciting for me. My parents had a shop, so it's like kind of bargain, wasn't it? You got two poems from one. It's great. So just thinking, I think there's a park, I can't remember if it was in Bradford or something like that. A new park had opened up and used the metaphor for social harmony. So I just want to play around the tension of that.
Yeah. Can I just say it's interesting to have this poem after you've just spoken about the kind of the UN-ness of poetry in such kind of positive terms, to have this...
I suppose UN also spells un, doesn't
yes.
it? Unrelationship.
Yes, this UN/un poem.
Right. Okay, I'll try and read this. So all we smiley blacks. The orient sun zaps us out of our suburban sepia for the revamped brownfield, where the snip red ribbon disarms our badly lumped blacks. Come shelter in here, booms the parkie, who salutes the mayor, then summons rockets of confetti parachuting on our regiments of speakers, tricksters, clowns, crowds, drummers and strummers, shores of us streaming through the gates in our native gears. Bullets of light phosphor the applauding leaves and inspect the plastic petticoat parade of saplings as the grass lets go with a to and fro of Mexican waves for masked children who kick from orange and cherry swings, diving with some in the spongy sandpit for hide and seek. All leaders improvise with a massive khaki ground sheet, so we may feast on our picnic of chapatis and patties and teas. A humble-looking man splits a bomb-shaped chum-chum, leaking its syrup with a low-caste smiling woman. An ordinary drowns his lover with almondy puffs through dandelion clocks that fluff her thread of buttons. The parkie, with his totem wand at the heavens, boots up a stark of clouds. They outline nations of the globe, so that sky is a screen on which world is mapped. His wand now joins each nation, world a flown pink commingling of clouds on our patch in Slough, whirling so we wage the graft of continents at once. Sphered birds dispersed for smithereen air shows, platooning through the cumulus kissing continents, as butterflies aspire to kaleidoscope the sky. Gaping, we gasp on gases of air that blast the darkest hunted reaches of our afeared hearts. One of us juggling skittles at the flush of this oceanless, borderless. Hugging a tree is a stone's throw away from our ancestors. Every day, just there in Africa. One of us blesses. We're everywhere, welcome to stay. One of us swarthily. Is that cloud for England and India? Is the stamp of our arrival, our passport, this park, this hologram of home? We holler the flag of our dance. Okay, and I'll finish with my GCSE poem, Singsong. Okay. So yeah, do I need to say anything? I think it's quite a tricky poem actually for students, because I'd probably write it differently now. I'd probably make it much cleaner, the sort of person I am now. But at that point I want to make sure it wasn't clean, that it didn't all quite make sense. So in the fourth verse I do imagine, in my head was, I imagine she runs an internet arranged marriage company, the wife. So she's got this kind of business, modern business upstairs, and he runs a corner shop downstairs. So anyway, so Singsong. I run just one of my daddy's shops from 9 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and he want me not to have a break. But when nobody in, I do the lock. 'Cause up the stairs is my newly bride. We share in chapati, we share in the chutney, after we have made love like rowing through Putney. When I return with my pinny untied, the shoppers always point and cry, "Hey, Sing, where you been? Your lemons are limes, Your bananas are plantain. This dirty little floor need a little bit of mop in the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road. Above my head, high-heeled at the ground, as my wife on the web is playing with the mouse. When she netting 2 cat on her sea clover side, she booked them for the meat at the cheese of a price. My bride, she effing at my mum in all the colours of Punjabi, then stumble like a drunk making fun of my daddy. My bride, tiny eyes of a gun and the tummy of a teddy. My bride, she have a red crew cut and she wear a tartan sari, a donkey jacket and some pumps. On the squeak of the girls that are pinching my sweeties. When I return from the tickle of my bride, the shoppers always point and cry, "Hey, Sing, where you been? The milk is out of date and the bread is always stale. The things you have on offer you have never got in stock in the worst Indian shop on the whole Indian road." Late in the midnight hour, when you shoppers are wrap up quiet, when the precinct is concrete cool, we come down whispering stairs and sit on my silver stool. From behind the chocolate bars, we stare past the half-price window signs at the beaches of the UK in the brighty moon. From the stool each night she say, "How much do you charge for that moon, baby?" From the stool each night I say, "Is half the cost of you, baby." From the stool each night she say, "How much does that come to, baby?" From the stool each night I say, "Is priceless, baby." Okay, thank you.
That was marvellous. Daljit, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for such a stimulating discussion.